Good day, mates. My name is Mordecai, and welcome back to the show, where an aspiring roleplayer narrates various RPG-related stories as a learning tool. The first time a new player rolls up to the table to play in a campaign is always an exciting moment, and the new player may have a character concept in mind that serves as the premise for producing a powerful character, which is not necessarily a bad idea, since it can motivate the player into learning more about the hobby by giving them a potentially solid foundation. However, that same motivation can originate from playing a merely average or even a weak character, and that versatility is just as important. Regardless of how a new player intends to do with their first character in the tabletop role-playing scene, or even if said character is an experienced veteran who has played at multiple tables, there is a need to keep an eye out for red flags. Red flags are a shorthand phrase for warning signs that the particular game or players at said game are not necessarily a good fit for players. These red flags can be a wide variety of hazards, ranging from blatant power gaming, favoritism towards a particular player, homebrew elements and mechanics that are completely bonkers, and especially in the case of RPG horror story narrators, stories that are constructed with such poor grammar that renders the narrator crying into their pillow at night? Wait a minute. I don't recall writing that last part in the script. The usual response upon seeing any of these red flags is to take notice as to how they are negatively impacting the overall experience, attempt to discuss with the party as to how to avoid these red flags, and continue with the game with those considerations. After all, sometimes amazing stories have resulted from games that started out waving a lot of these red flags. However, before we begin with today's narration, I do have to give a rather big disclaimer. This story has some bad punctuation and grammar, although in some places that translates to a more intriguing story. If you want some idea as to how bad one of the red flags are in this story, and how interesting the grammar is, here's an excerpt lifted directly from the story as it was written at the time of this video. The wizard was granted access to a free spell once per day that could summon a maximum of 48 d6, and that guy continued to build ridiculous out-of-place stuff that I can't even remember. So, 48 d6, what exactly is being summoned by the spell? Is it skeletons? Is it Tarrasques? Are you telling me that the Dungeon Master literally gave someone the ability to once per day summon up to 288 Tarrasques onto a battlefield? And really, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So, just how much more interesting does this scenario get? Well, let us find out, as we embark on yet another delve. Before we begin with today's story, if you like my content or want to support the channel, feel free to subscribe and leave a like on the video. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. Let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPG horror stories. Today's narrative is titled The Campaign-Long Origin Story, and is written by user Alex Wolf. So, this took place in a mostly homebrewed game played over Discord around 5 to 6 years ago, which very quickly went downhill thanks to the Dungeon Master and that guy. This is the second attempt at this story, which spans a whole campaign, as basically the entire thing was a horror story. As when writing the first draft, I was very tired, but I got some very helpful feedback on the last attempt, so hopefully this comes across well and you have fun reading. Also, I have no clue why it auto-corrected horror to origin, but there you go. The game in question featured myself, playing as the fighter Titus, who was the son of a legendary hero named Magnus the Invincible, and a mage named Faye Aeris, who, thanks to a deal she made with a dragon Magnus would then go on to kill, meant that he had a dragon permanently stuck in his head. I honestly thought that it would be a really cool thing to roleplay, that could help make the Dungeon Master produce a story. Another player in the game who isn't as important to the story is Titus's younger twin brother, who we'll call the Wizard. There was also a mimic who I think was a rogue, who was only in the game for a very short time. And then that guy, who was playing a gnome artificer who, because of homebrew mechanics, could make literally anything in an instant with a few nuts and bolts. He started the campaign with a Tesla cannon and a full suit of power armor. We'll call him what he is. That guy. And so, the campaign started off with each of us being summoned to this village by an NPC, who would later be revealed to be both mine and the wizard's grandmother on our mother's side, with each of us appearing in a pool that I was able to recall off of my memory, but there was no reason given for the summoning. We then do some very basic quests around the village, and I end up getting a ring that lets me hear the truth of what people were saying. So, for example, if we were told, "Monsters are stealing my supplies," and they were lying, I would hear, "Monsters are stealing my supplies that I actually stole from them." The Dungeon Master used this once, and then never bothered with it again, despite me reminding him that this was a thing. The NPC who summoned us then gives us a button of some description that will teleport us back here if it is at all needed. Let's pause for a moment to say that even early on the Dungeon Master is waving enough red flags that I think we can all agree that
it's raw.
For the moment, it is a safe bet that the biggest red flag is the homebrew that guy has been allowed to use. Also, if you have been reading each of the slides, you may have noticed that I am putting in a significant amount of correction as I am reading the story to the best of my ability. I would like to take a moment to say that what is written on the slides is the story as it was written on the subreddit. It wasn't a mistake in editing. We will talk about that as part of the Afterthoughts. Later on, as we were heading down the mountain, we fought off some goblins and met our fourth party member, who was disguised as a chest. We also found a dwarven mine being set up through a door. They give us some quests, which leads us to what the Dungeon Master described as the First Plains level. And during our time there, we face a dungeon with puzzles that are weirdly specific to us, like pressing portraits of monsters in the order we found and fought them, even though that makes no sense and probably led to the deaths of anyone other than us who tried to solve it. Oh, that's cool. The Dungeon Master is borrowing elements from old-school graphic adventure games.
Oh, come on.
This would be funny if this were the punchline to a joke for the players, like some sort of commentary on why mainstream audiences believed for a long time that the graphic adventure game genre was dead. Although, in strict fairness, one of the reasons for that common perception was the genre had an abundance of nonsense puzzles, such as what we just read in the story. Let's think of a made-up scenario. We have a river we need to cross with fast-moving water. How would we cross that river? Build a raft and paddle across? Maybe look for a shallower part of the river to traverse safely? Perhaps even swim if you're an athlete? Well, the graphic adventure genre, as it was in the late 90s, would have you believe the solution was to heat some bubblegum in a frying pan before flinging the concoction in a mathematically perfect arc to build a bridge over the river. Let's move on with the story. Over the next few sessions, we meet a sentient talking raven who was just there. Finishing up our side quests, we also meet some high-level NPC who claims to show you how it's done, with me being granted a sword that does 46 damage despite me being second or third level at this point, and then immediately getting an additional sword that I think did 66 damage, and could be upgraded so that it could do fire damage and fire a beam. This is before we all get sent to deal with someone rolling a toll booth on a small path at the base of the mountain that for some reason a lot of people are using? I'm sorry, but I have to point out that the stuff in this story just sort of happens. Very on point for that old school graphic adventure game feel, having a lot of events occurring with seemingly no build-up and no real logic behind them, and no real consequences afterwards. This already has me deeply concerned as to what sort of game the Dungeon Master is running here. The "let me show you how it's done" NPC shows up for about a minute before walking off, leaving us alone with this other guy who somehow evolves a bird into a deity with a staff, which conveniently got destroyed after we beat him, and my dragon mate, who I thought was going to be a fun thing where he chimes in occasionally and gives advice, makes an appearance outside of my head for a short sentence before just giving me a breath weapon. Meanwhile, that guy has now upgraded his power armor so that it reflects damage onto enemies when he is hit, and has upgraded his Tesla cannon such that it can do an unlimited amount of damage depending upon the roll, and of course, a grenade launcher. At this point, it is worth mentioning that I have weapons that now do 8d6 or more per attack, along with a shield that deals 2d6 bludgeoning damage when an attack misses me. The wizard was granted a free spell once per day that could summon a maximum of 48d6. We'll just assume it's something innocuous, like maybe low power air elementals. And that guy who continued to build ridiculous stuff that I can't even remember. The Dungeon Master decides that rather than balance weapons to a level appropriate to adventurers who were level 3 or 4, I can't really remember, at the time, to instead just throw massive bosses at us for every single encounter, instead of normal stuff you'd be fighting at our level, which made every combat a huge slog. A lot of bosses, and an obligatory Halloween special later, we make it to the second plains level, which made me think of a poorly designed video game with another level visibly above it, and we head into a town where I wanted to find a library to research the dragon I had in my head, that I was told about in one of the few messages I had from the dragon in my head. But instead of a library, we find the town hall which had 3 pedestals inside, just like the portrait puzzle, although this one needed 3 things extremely specific to each of us. And this one required us each to sacrifice that specific item. Upon doing this, we found ourselves in a huge destroyed, extra-planar library. Instead of, a normal one, I have no idea. Which led us to an old man who just so happened to be the husband of what would soon be revealed to be mine and the wizard's grandmother. That guy then kills him moments before he was meant to die of old age, for the experience. And a little distraught, my character accepts the contract to kill some prison being. We were, I think, level 5 by this point, and that guy continued to defy logic and made an actual car, fuel and all, and we make our way to where this being is.
It's raw!
When we arrive at the cave, we find a stream that turns things that touch it into crystal. That guy walks off to nowhere, leaving me and the wizard to nearly die from suffocation after getting completely turned into crystal. With that guy returning soon afterwards, having received some sort of huge power-up, and having found the prison being after completing some more weird puzzles. So, I am assuming that since the story mentioned no saving throw being asked for by the Dungeon Master, that maybe it was an automatic fail on the saving throw with the crystal petrification of the player characters. The fight with the prison being was extremely annoying, as he had these 8 crystals floating around him, 2 of which could be used on each round of combat as far as I can recall, and all 8 of them needed to be destroyed before this boss could take any meaningful damage, which would be a rather cool mechanic if the crystals didn't have crazily high armor class. It is worth mentioning that the fireball spell, which the wizard had, and would have actually dealt 13d8 damage to each of these crystals, was not used against these for some reason. 5 or more rounds later, we had only managed to destroy one of the crystals, and the blue crystal is used for the first time, which merely raised the water level, but because a natural 20 was rolled, the entire room was flooded for a second with the special crystal water, meaning that we were completely encased in it, and immediately started suffocating and taking damage as we once again underwent crystal petrification. Eventually, before we die, I suddenly get a one-time use ability from the dragon that immediately breaks the crystals surrounding each of us and heals everyone but me to full health. The Dungeon Master then, on an attack rolling system that he did, he rolled a dice to see who was attacked rather than running the monsters like intelligent beings. I then die and get attacked again through this system despite being down, killing me instantly and then ending the session. In the next session, this creature immediately goes, "Stop fighting me and I can save your friend," before proceeding to completely flatten me. That guy then wanders off again to where we later learn is an area planned for the three of us that he never bothered to rebalance for just one person, and thus that guy dies. However, for some reason, this actually benefits him because he just got brought back as the literal Avatar of Death, able to get stronger whenever he goes below 0 hit points, and allowing him to summon any monster we had previously killed as an undead minion. Wait. Time out for a second. What just happened here? Let's go back and read that last part again. But for some reason, dying benefits him because he just got brought back immediately as the literal Avatar of Death, able to get stronger whenever he goes below 0 hit points, and allowing him to summon any monster we had killed previously as an undead minion. Viewers and members of the audience, some sort of line has just been crossed. Now, I get wanting to have a powerful character that is able to fight off celestial horrors that no man should be exposed to, but that guy is straight up able to negate death? Now, in some video games and tabletop role-playing games, characters that die can get the option of being respawned or resurrected after dying, but it's always at some price. That guy is allowed to do that on the spot at no effective cost at level 5 out of 20?
Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. What are you doing? Oh my god.
I don't know why, but
Oh my god.
the wizard was granted an ability to summon a maximum of 48 d6. What exactly? Is it skeletons? Is it Tarrasques? Why is that guy allowed to just invent a car in a medieval fantasy setting? Why is every encounter a mini-boss now? Why, oh why, is the campaign an old-school graphic adventure game? No, stop. This has been wearing me down this whole story. That guy has been allowed and granted the ability to do completely crazy things that are rather absurd. It is worth mentioning that the Dungeon Master is allowing him to do so, consequence-free, to become blatantly overpowered, like some sort of crazy player-based Dungeon Master Mary Sue, combined from various bits and pieces derived from the worst nightmares of every RPG horror story narrator. And now that he is in a position where he could actually be at risk of dying, it turns out he can't actually die! What hot garbage! Okay, my miniature rant is over. So let's talk about the red flags for Dungeon Master and that guy just hoisted on the red flag parade. Death is an important mechanic in every game. It provides a very undesirable outcome, since dying is always costly, even when it can be cheated. And with the potential to die, you can also have moments where a character's death is in service of a fantastic plot beat, where the sacrifice of one party member saves the world, or else motivates the entire party to take action against a big threat. Those that have watched Critical Role's second campaign saw the Mighty Nine become motivated in a manner previously unseen when Mravunac was killed at the hands of Lorenzo, and the ensuing boss fight that occurred afterwards where Mravunac was avenged. So by having a character that is unable to die, you're depriving not only yourself of that experience, but also your fellow party members, especially when one of them performed a sacrifice to bring back the rest of the party to full health in the actual pitched boss fight, which means that the entire plot beat of that dragon spirit lending its strength for the party in a critical moment was entirely pointless. Which also means that any tension from a would-be death scenario is also completely mitigated. Imagine, if you will for a moment, a situation in which the roles were reversed, and it was the horde of enemies which were granted the ability to immediately resurrect upon death. I am sure you can all imagine how unfair that would feel to the party. And with this little analysis done, let's get back to the story. While this is happening, the wizard uses that button that the NPC gave us at the beginning of the campaign to try and get help for me, which immediately summons my grandmother, who happened to be that same NPC, who happened to resurrect me on the spot. At this point, 8 drakes, or rather dragon-like beings, start attacking us. She casts some spell to shield against fire, but she has to recast it constantly to shift the elemental resistance around, so it's basically just me and the wizard fighting against 8 dragons, which are apparently drakes, but they're being ran as though they're dragons anyway, with flight and breath weapons, etc. I stay near the wizard and my grandmother, and when almost all of these drakes focus my grandmother, I try and protect her as she goes down, before being told I'm somehow on the other side of the battle map. The next turn comes around, and the Dungeon Master goes, if this rolls an arbitrary number, the dragons go after her, and apparently rolled that exact number, resulting in her dying immediately. It is worth mentioning that up until this point, I was actually somewhat enjoying the game in the moment, but I was getting more irritated with the more railroady aspects. And whilst that guy was annoying, he wasn't a blatant problem player as far as I knew. Looking back, I do see a lot of warning signs that should have indicated to me that he was a problem player, but I have forgotten some of the details due to how long it's been since these events took place. In the context of this story, however, this soon changed after he randomly showed up after the fight, and we now learn about his new power boost as a reward for wandering off and dying. And after this point, he started getting much more disturbing. Feeling extremely jaded with that guy getting tons of rewards and special things, I say to the Dungeon Master, I want to gather meteorite and make a sword from it with special properties. And so, we were off towards a mountain where such a thing could be found. But not before grabbing supplies from that dwarven mine, which at this point was maybe a week old, and we learned that they were giving up and shutting down, as that adventurer, the annoying NPC we'd encountered a bunch of times before now, wasn't donating, which apparently meant that for some reason they could no longer run the mine, which would have brought them the money to be able to afford the supplies they needed? Either way, we fly to the special mountain and get shot at by a fort which was actively mining the mountain with lots of activity and could no longer access it. But rather than us offering payment, they hold us at sword point, about 100 or more of them, to open up access for them and give them a portion of what we mined. Inside this mountain, we fight some monsters that are also doors and a swarm of tiny zombies that multiplied by 8 with each round. The rapidly increasing sheer numbers made them impossible to deal with until we somehow killed them by the end of it, when the wizard had used up all of his spell slots, using magic missile to hit the door, which was otherwise unreachable. We then mined some meteorite chunks that were just sitting there, with that guy summoning a bunch of skeletons to help, and taking a considerable amount of the meteorite with him. The next session we find 4 random gems in each of the corners of the boss room, whilst I as a player was just bored and mucking about with the door mechanism. It rotated or something. And eventually move on to the capital since my father left me a house. I decided I could go to a blacksmith in the capital and get a sword from the meteorite. And at this point, that guy got even more creepy. That annoying NPC we had found a bunch of times randomly turns up and tries to steal some items from us before that guy has his skeletons force him off the ledge of this mountain after we'd already decided to walk away, and then has skeletal hands burst out of the mountain and move him, hanging him upside down in front of us before describing... Oh no. Oh, you bet if I was reading that out loud I'd have to, you know, go grab the bucket. Ugh. Before killing him and keeping him as yet another undead servant. I then get about 30% of what I had gathered taken away while that guy loses absolutely nothing as a result of the mining tax. We eventually reach the city, which for some reason is blocked by 4 light beams, which happen to be the exact colour of the gems we found, which for some reason then randomly makes one of them fly out of our gear and back towards that mountain. Which made me wonder how anyone even got in or out of the capital city for a country. When we eventually get to the house in the capital, I use the key that was left to both me and the wizard, but find it not working. Instead, we find that the house is occupied by some older couple, who changed the locks after our mother sold the house that was left to me and the wizard, who were more than of age when read in the will somehow. Even more frustrated that I was just being ignored and losing stuff, whilst that guy was just gaining and profiteering massively, I head over to the blacksmith to get my space sword made from the meteorites. I then learned that my large amount of meteorite was actually only enough for a dagger, and guess who has enough to have made that an actual sword? That guy then tells me he's not going to let me have the remaining meteorite I need unless I pay him literally everything I have, and a bunch of this other stuff that I didn't even have access to, and even admits at the point that he was just doing this because I wanted a thing. At this point, I finally learned the significance of the phrase, "No Dungeons and Dragons is better than bad Dungeons and Dragons." And so I left, sick of being bullied after I had noticed what was happening. And so concludes a horror story that spanned an entire campaign. I know that it's a bit long, but I hope it is concise, well structured, and seems worthy of joining the prestigious rank of all these fantastic horror stories. I admit I could and should have been a better player and noticed a lot more of the red flags, but the wizard was generally quiet, and with me still being inexperienced, I thought that what I was seeing was acceptable or fine. I just wish I had left earlier, especially when it became a clear pattern, and I should have confronted the Dungeon Master and that guy. I am, however, free of them, and am in some fantastic games right now. I hope you enjoyed reading, and I shall wish you a nice day. And that's the end of the story. There's quite a lot to talk about with regards to the story, in terms of what happened with regards to the campaign as a whole, and how the story itself is written. So we will tackle the analysis in that way, starting off with what considerations we can take away to improve the game and play aspects, and then delving into the literature aspects that unfortunately take away from the story as a whole. Let's talk about the red flags that are present from the start of the campaign. The lack of a Session 0 to establish to all the players that the campaign was going to be a power fantasy fueled fever dream is certainly noteworthy. Having that Session 0 would have certainly helped to explain why the Gnome Artificer was allowed to build a suit of power armor like it was directly lifted from Halo, or to build a motorized vehicle, in a setting that is clearly established as an otherwise medieval fantasy environment. And if you want to allow that in your setting, that's fine, but be aware as to how allowing that to happen can impact the overall feel of the game, and not necessarily in a good manner, which will lead to more red flags being put on display for the party members that are not on board with the game as it is being ran, especially for the players at the table that are not as experienced. Perhaps the biggest indication about the overall lack of consideration with regards to the overall play of the game is presented by the red flag factors correlating with the emphasis on power fantasy and the graphic adventure game inspired narrative. Now, I am not against power fantasy provided that it is done correctly, but having a favourite player who becomes an avatar of death upon dying at level 5 out of 20 is just one instance amongst many others on how not to do it even remotely within the farthest stretches of correctly. Especially when moments earlier the poster's character sacrificed all of their health to fully restore everyone else's, and is also being pounded away by a boss mob that literally betrays its own words. Then later you have that guy literally stomping over that same character's personal side goal. And when combined with the frequent mini-boss encounters, the skewed balance of damage output and tanking across the party, and the obtuse nature of the world in the campaign, there are some rather big problems. So let's segue into the graphic adventure game inspired narrative that the campaign endorsed. A good rule of thumb for designing puzzles is checking the puzzle for how it fits into the world, if the puzzle itself can be reasonably solved without any form of abstract logic, and if the puzzle does not resort to nonsense elements. Whilst a lot of old school graphic adventure video games have puzzles that fit into the world presented, very few had puzzles that could be solved without abstract logic or nonsense elements. The campaign that this story covered adhered to that, in the elements of its puzzles, the overall flow of the story having complete nonsense at points, and how much of a railroad the party was strung along. Not to mention the distinct favoritism towards that guy, granting him immortality within the same session that a party member sacrificed their health points to heal the party. Just as a kind of example of the party imbalance that was at play, and what kind of the game the Dungeon Master was running. When putting all of these aspects together, it indicates that every wrong turn that could be taken towards an RPG horror story scenario has indeed been taken, and we end up very, very lost in the Byzantine labyrinth of the RPG horror story realm. Thus, we can conclude that one of the main considerations to take away from this story, for a Dungeon Master in particular, are to avoid running a game that is like this amalgamation of nonsense and skewed weirdness. And that's a shame because of the wasted potential of a full-length campaign that could have been had, that could have left all of the players with wonderful experiences. But alas, the only party member who has had a quote-unquote wonderful experience was that guy who was denied the thrill of death. This now brings us to how the story was written. When I first read this story, the thought of it being a fake story did occur to me, like it was some form of elaborate meme post, especially with the bit at the end with what some would say was a bit delusional of the original poster. It took some research to figure out that this story is most likely real despite the bad grammar, punctuation, missing words, and arbitrary nonsense that is present within the campaign. It is worth mentioning that this story is indeed a repost, as the first slide informs us that this isn't the original post of this story. The original narrative was titled The Saga of Titus, posted roughly a month earlier, and is unfortunately a practically unreadable story. Which I believe to be the main reason why this post isn't marked as a repost, since the original got heavily downvoted for being unreadable. And as it is currently written, it does allow for the meme of a dungeon master possibly granting a low-level player the ability to summon up to 288 Tarrasques onto a battlefield, which to me will never not stop being funny. If the original poster of this story is listening to this video, I would highly recommend that the next time this story is posted, if it ever is, that the story get proofread before posting it. And don't be afraid of going back and editing the post afterwards to clear up any bad grammar, and leaving a small editor's note that you have done so, because, sincerely, whilst it is funny to me, I doubt it was Tarrasques being summoned by the wizard. Although that thought is still amusing to me even after that consideration. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed my content and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe and give the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. And with that, I shall see you all next time.